Why suit started with a perfectly legal act: parking a truck on private property. A simple, temporary courtesy that instantly transformed into a declaration of war. That initial frantic knock wasn't a neighborly greeting. It was the HOA's first strike. A shrill demand, backed by the threat of a $500 fine, and the arrogant certainty that they held all the power. They believed they had cornered a quiet, rule-abiding resident. They had no idea they weren't just attacking a homeowner. They were challenging a life lived by a very different, far more demanding set of rules. They were about to learn that some battles should never be picked, especially when your opponent's authority isn't measured in petty bylaws, but in stars and stripes. What happens when neighborhood arrogance meets a highly trained, silent force? The house at 14 Willow Creek wasn't grand. It was intentional, dude. Its owner, whom we will call Alex, had chosen the quiet, manicured uniformity of the Sycamore Heights development precisely for its anonymity. After years spent living under the demanding, bright spotlight of public service, Alex needed a place where the most complex decision of the day was choosing between dark roast or espresso. The lawn was always cut to the regulation 3-inch height. The trash cans were never visible before Tuesday evening, and the paint color was the precise shade of pewter gray, mandated by the covenants. It was a life built on impeccable compliance, a life Alex appreciated and frankly, excelled at. But perfect compliance is irrelevant to a person seeking conflict. The antagonist wasn't the HOA board itself, but a singular, self-appointed engine of community enforcement: Mrs. Albright. She was the neighbor who didn't just attend the monthly meeting. She was the meeting. Her home, directly across the cul-de-sac, functioned as the community watchtower. Every misplaced recycling bin, every overgrown shrub, and every car parked 6 inches over the property line was logged, photographed, and weaponized. The fragile piece of Sycamore Heights began to fray on a cool Saturday morning. Alex was expecting a large, specialized delivery, a utility vehicle far too heavy for the narrow suburban driveway. To facilitate the quick, safe transfer, Alex placed a temporary, bright orange traffic cone and a single, heavy-duty truck across the mouth of the driveway, completely within the boundaries of the property line. It was a clear, logical safety measure. In Mrs. Albright's eyes, however, it was a flagrant violation of order, a personalized challenge to her absolute authority. The brief, necessary presence of that truck was the tiny spark that would soon ignite the quiet neighborhood into a bonfire of petty war. The question wasn't if she would escalate, but how far she would go to restore her version of peace. The first registered letter arrived exactly 72 hours after the delivery truck vanished. It wasn't signed by the HOA president or a faceless lawyer. It was stamped with the unmistakable signature of Mrs. Albright, titled simply as Architectural Review Committee Chair. The document, dense with italicized jargon, accused Alex of gross disregard for community aesthetic standards and included 2 blurry, damning photographs of the temporary truck. The penalty: a $500 non-compliance fine, payable within 7 days, or the fee would double. This wasn't about parking. This was about a power grab. Alex, having spent a career navigating bureaucracy far more complex and dangerous than a suburban HOA, responded with detached professionalism. A polite, meticulously crafted letter was sent back, citing the specific clause in the bylaws that permitted temporary vehicles for essential deliveries and concluding with a copy of the town's fire safety code, which permitted the temporary blockage. It was a checkmate based purely on logic and rule following. It should have ended there. But the amateur bureaucrat is fueled not by logic, but by indignation. Mrs. Albright saw the detailed, fact-based response not as compliance, but as defiance. Her reaction was immediate and deeply personal. The next wave of harassment wasn't official. It was surveillance. Alex began noticing the subtle, unnerving changes. The flash of a camera lens from across the street, the slow drive-by of Mrs. Albright's pristine SUV, the way her blinds would snap shut the second Alex's car pulled into the driveway. The HOA's formal system had failed her, so she resorted to the oldest weapon in neighborhood politics: petty, unrelenting intrusion. Then came the weed witch hunt. The HOA's newest demand focused on the landscaping. The letter, issued 3 weeks later, accused Alex of having non-approved, invasive perennials in the small flower bed near the porch. It was an absurdity. The plants were standard azaleas, identical to dozens in the neighborhood. But the violation wasn't the azalea. It was a single, tiny patch of clover, a resilient weed that must have sprouted overnight. The letter was specific, cruel, and non-negotiable. A $250 fine and a mandate to remove the entire flower bed within 48 hours to prevent future ecological disruption. This wasn't enforcing rules. This was retribution. Alex's calmness began to crack, replaced by a deep, familiar sense of righteous determination. This wasn't about the money. It was about the precedent. Allowing this blatant abuse of authority to stand would validate Mrs. Albright's tyrannical reign over the entire community. It was time to stop playing by her distorted rules. Alex made a call, not to a local lawyer but to a different kind of authority. The details of the conversation were brief and cryptic, involving specific clauses of military housing acts and a reference to the Judge Advocate General's JAG Corps. The conversation ended with a quiet affirmation and a promise that the necessary documentation would be drafted and ready within the week. This was preparation for an escalation that Mrs. Albright, with her small-town bylaws and community college legal certificate, could never anticipate. The final straw, the event that perfectly set the stage for the coming confrontation, involved the American flag. Alex, in a simple act of patriotism and tradition, decided to install a small, elegant flagpole near the porch. No HOA rule explicitly forbade it, but Mrs. Albright saw an opportunity. The next day, 2 police cruisers pulled up to 14 Willow Creek. Mrs. Albright, standing triumphantly on the curb, was the one who had called them. She claimed the flagpole was a structural hazard and an unauthorized permanent alteration that posed a danger to children. As the police officers approached, Alex simply walked out, carrying a small, official-looking document. It wasn't a permit. It was a legal exemption. The moment Alex handed the lead officer the document, the entire dynamic shifted. The officer's eyes widened, then snapped to Mrs. Albright, who was now smiling, certain of her victory. The officer quietly informed her that not only was the flagpole staying, but that under federal law, any further harassment or attempt to remove it could result in serious legal penalties for the HOA. The officer finished by stating simply that Mrs. Albright had just initiated a dispute with someone the Secretary of Defense was legally obligated to protect. Mrs. Albright's confident smile evaporated, replaced by a look of dawning horror. She hadn't been fighting a homeowner. She had been fighting an institution, but she was too far gone to back down. Humiliated in front of the police, she vowed aloud that this was far from over. Alex, watching her retreat across the lawn, knew exactly what was coming next. The final, desperate act of a petty tyrant about to face a power she never knew existed. The stage was set for a public clash at the annual community meeting, where Mrs. Albright would attempt to use the full weight of the HOA to publicly shame and fine Alex into submission. She had the bylaws. Alex had the law, and the confrontation was only days away. The air in the Sycamore Heights Community Center was thick, not just with the humidity of late summer, but with unspoken tension. This was the annual General Assembly, an event usually dedicated to discussing pool maintenance and trimming budgets. But tonight, everyone knew the real agenda was seated front and center. Mrs. Albright, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light, sat at the head table with the satisfied, predatory look of a prosecutor preparing her closing argument. Every eye in the room, the curious, the fearful, and the quietly resentful, was fixed on Alex, sitting calmly in the third row. Mrs. Albright began her presentation with a theatrical sigh, her voice dripping with artificial regret. She bypassed the mundane issues and launched directly into the matter of gross misconduct at 14 Willow Creek. The projector screen flashed up, not showing the original truck violation, but a highly edited, dramatized slideshow of the clover, the flag, and the vague accusations of disruptive nonconformity. She painted a picture of a rogue, defiant resident who believed they were above the very rules that preserved their property values. Her rhetoric was masterful, designed to mobilize the fear and self-interest of the 100-plus homeowners present. When she finished, She didn't just ask for the $750 in outstanding fines. She moved for a special assessment against Alex's property, a legal maneuver that would effectively place a lien on the house, potentially forcing a sale to cover future compliance risks. It was the ultimate vindictive abuse of the HOA's limited power, a scorched earth tactic designed to crush any dissent. A hush fell over the room. The people knew it was unfair, but they also knew challenging Mrs. Albright meant becoming her next target. The vote was about to be called. Then Alex stood up. The motion was not called immediately. The rules mandated that the accused be allowed a final defense. Alex walked toward the front, not with the hesitant steps of a victim, but with the measured, deliberate stride of a person entering their command post. Mrs. Albright leaned back, a smug, contemptuous smile fixed on her face, ready to swat down whatever weak protest was offered. Alex did not plead. Alex did not apologize. Alex simply placed a single, thick manila folder on the table, sliding it past the water pitchers until it rested directly in front of Mrs. Albright. The folder contained no homeowner documentation. Instead, the first page was a copy of the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act, SSCRA, highlighted in bright yellow. The initial silence was shattered by a low, collective murmur. Mrs. Albright, her hands trembling slightly, opened the folder. The room watched, mesmerized, as the blood drained from her face. Alex began to speak, the voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the anxiety of the room like a steel wire. I have no objection to the HOA's stated purpose of maintaining community standards. But for the past 4 months, the chair of the Architectural Review Committee has engaged in targeted, malicious harassment, exceeding her authority and incurring potential liability for every member of this board. Alex then detailed the second document in the folder, an official letter on high-security, heavy-stock paper, bearing the seal of the United States Department of Defense. It confirmed Alex's status not merely as a resident, but as a high-ranking military colonel actively serving in a capacity that required specific, federally protected housing rights. The room gasped. The sheer, terrifying disconnect between the petty drama of a clover weed and the gravity of a federal document was stunning. Alex continued, listing the specific statutes Mrs. Albright had violated, detailing how her repeated, documented calls to local law enforcement and her attempts to enforce rules preempted by federal law amounted to a clear infringement on a serving officer's rights. The flagpole, the driveway blockage, the azaleas, every single action Mrs. Albright had weaponized was, in fact, protected. The true bombshell arrived with the third document, a notice from the JAG Corps. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement. The United States government, through the Judge Advocate General's office, was officially requesting all of Mrs. Albright's communications, records, and committee notes regarding Alex's property for review. Mrs. Albright was no longer smiling. Her face was a mask of utter panic, realizing that her neighborhood crusade had just crossed an invisible, highly protected legal boundary. She had called the police on a technicality. Alex had responded by activating a federal response. Alex didn't need to say anything more about the fines. The question of whether the community would impose a lien was now irrelevant. The real question was how the community would survive the legal fallout of the liability Mrs. Albright had single-handedly incurred. Alex turned back to the crowd, the silence now deafening. I moved here for quiet, but I will not tolerate this abuse of power. You all have a choice to make tonight. Endorse this malice, or choose accountability. The vote on the assessment never happened. In a frantic, unprecedented move, one of the other board members, a man who had been silently terrified for months, moved for an immediate and permanent removal of Mrs. Albright from all HOA committees. The vote was instant, overwhelming, and absolute. As Mrs. Albright scrambled to gather her papers, her humiliation was total. She was stripped of her power, exposed as a petty bully, and now faced a potential legal nightmare from an opponent whose true authority she had critically underestimated. The neighborhood watched as the once powerful tyrant was escorted out of the room, her reign ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, chilling realization that she hadn't been dealing with a simple homeowner, but with an officer trained to win battles on every scale. The silence that followed Mrs. Albright's hurried retreat was the most profound peace Sycamore Heights had ever experienced. It was the silence of a fever breaking, the sudden deflation after weeks of unbearable pressure. The other board members, pale and shaken, immediately capitulated. They didn't just reverse the motion for the special assessment. They instantly, unanimously, and permanently vacated all fines ever levied against Alex. They were scrambling, frantic to create a paper trail that proved their sudden, fervent change of heart and their complete distance from the now disgraced former chair. Their only remaining goal was to minimize the corporate liability that Mrs. Albright had so carelessly invited upon them. The immediate fallout focused entirely on the HOA's treasury. The Judge Advocate General's office, as promised, initiated a quiet but comprehensive review. This wasn't a public trial, it was a cold, forensic investigation into the HOA's governance structure and the specific application of the SSCRA, Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act. The HOA, now operating under the paralyzing fear of federal scrutiny, was forced to hire expensive, top-tier legal counsel from the city, a necessity that bled their reserves dry. Every petty fine, every harassing email, and every overzealous enforcement action Mrs. Albright had documented was meticulously reviewed, cross-referenced with federal regulations, and deemed a potential liability. The irony was almost poetic. The woman obsessed with maintaining property values through fines had, in her final act, financially crippled the entire association through legal fees. The tens of thousands of dollars spent on counsel served as a heavy, involuntary payment for a masterclass in abuse of power. Within 3 weeks, the for sale sign appeared on Mrs. Albright's immaculate front lawn. She had not waited for the formal outcome of the review. The shame, the sudden loss of her long-held, self-inflated authority, and the realization that the entire community knew she had nearly bankrupted them over a misplaced clover weed and a parked truck were too much to bear. She became a pariah overnight, her surveillance efforts replaced by the absolute certainty that the entire neighborhood was now watching her. Her retreat was swift, silent, and entirely self-inflicted, the architect of her own ruin, fleeing the very tyranny she had created. The long-term consequences reshaped the very soul of Sycamore Heights. The new board, operating in a state of perpetual anxiety, became a model of transparency and restraint. They rewrote the governing documents to include specific, non-negotiable clauses that protected not only military members but also broadened due process rights for all homeowners. The tyranny of the trivial was replaced by a cautious, collaborative governance. The days of punitive fines, warrantless surveillance, and rule enforcement based on personal vendetta were over. The community had been forced to mature, recognizing that allowing one person too much unchecked power would always lead to systemic failure. Alex, the reluctant hero of this suburban drama, returned seamlessly to a life of quiet anonymity. The truck was long gone, but the American flag stood proudly, a silent, immovable testament to the victory of federal law over local pettiness. Neighbors, who had previously avoided eye contact, now offered quick, respectful nods and mumbled thanks. There was a new, profound, and somewhat humorous layer of respect in the air. Alex was not celebrated as a hero. Alex was respected as the person who had quietly, decisively, and irrevocably ended the reign of terror with a single, perfectly timed folder. The deepest impact lay in the lesson learned. This conflict was never about parking or fines or even the flag. It was a study in scale. Mrs. Albright had operated on the smallest scale of power, that of neighborhood gossip and petty bureaucracy. Alex had operated on the largest scale, that of national defense and codified law. The entire dispute hinged on Mrs. Albright's fundamental failure to understand the identity of her opponent and the difference between a local rule and a federal mandate. She had brought a bylaw to a gunfight. The quiet of Sycamore Heights settled back in, but it was a better quiet, a peace built not on fear, but on a clear understanding of boundaries. Alex had achieved the ultimate goal, the right to simply exist on one's own property, free from frivolous interference. This story serves as a stark reminder. When dealing with petty tyrants, sometimes the only way to restore balance is to match their arrogance with an unassailable, undeniable authority. The power of a neighborhood association is terrifying until it collides with a power that operates far above its pay grade. Ask yourself, if your neighbor started a war over a weed, what hidden institutional power do you have ready to deploy? The answer might surprise you.